This morning we gather and we praise God for the life and work of Terry Fretheim and Faith Fretheim and Walter Brueggemann. This morning's lecture by Dr. Brueggemann is going to be on preaching the Old Testament. Last night, for those of you who were here, you got to hear Dr. Brueggemann's lecture about why the Old Testament must not go away, because it is the script through which the holiness of God enters into dialogical relationship and agency in the world. If you missed that talk, you can go to our website, luthersem.edu, and search Fretheim Lecture. It's also being made available on Luther Seminary's YouTube channel. If you don't know what that is, ask your grandchild, and they will hook you up. Terry Fretheim and Walter Brueggemann are two of the best Old Testament theologians in the world. I'm going to try that again because that was funny. Brueggemann and Fretheim are two of the best Old Testament theologians in the world. Are you with me now? I can bring in a whiteboard and diagram these jokes if you need. Terry Fretheim and Walter Brueggemann share many things, as Dr. Brueggemann pointed out last night. They are of a certain age together, and they share a history together. They share a pattern of male cranial baldness together. But most importantly, their orientation towards God is something that they share, that they have spent their lives deeply engaged with the Old Testament in search of God, and then making that God available to the rest of us in support of the mission of the church and in partnership with God in that mission. They have provided the best Old Testament theology of the last generation as scholarship for both the academic guild and for the church. Dr. Brueggemann's many books are probably well known to you, but let me just mention a few that, in case you do not have familiarity, you should. His book, The Psalms and the Life of Faith, has a couple of the most important Psalms essays of the last generation. His commentary on Genesis and Exodus have been groundbreaking. His massive book, Old Testament Theology, makes a great doorstop. Finally comes The Poet and The Prophetic Imagination, are two very important books on prophetic theology. I could go on, and as my dad used to say, if you haven't read them, read them again. Please welcome Dr. Brueggemann.
Well, I want to share with you what I thought, but I decided not to work so hard this morning as I did last night. You'll see we have a huge block of time, and we don't have to use it all. If we finish early, we'll start chapel earlier, and Terry can preach longer. But I thought, since my accent last night was on dialogical, that we ought to have some interaction. So I expect you to be at the microphones to carry your half of this. I did not review the correspondence that I had with Sally Peters about this, but my memory was that at some point she referred to this piece of the program as a workshop, and I was once in a session with Paul Tillich when I was in graduate school, and there were a whole bunch of people, and Tillich said, "Well, I'll sit down, that will make it a seminar." And that's what we did. So I hope you'll want to engage that, since all of us have established habits and passionate convictions about preaching. I have several convictions about preaching by way of starting. The first one is that preaching is hugely urgent at our moment in history. I believe that the health and well-being of our civil society depends on courageous, faithful preaching. And second, it follows from that it's about as hard a time for preaching as I know about. It may not be true in the Lutheran Church, but in many church traditions, the authority of the pastor has completely collapsed. So you have to get up and say things, and people imagine that you have no more credit to make a claim than anyone else does in the church. So that makes it very hard. The third conviction I have is that we all have our own way of doing that, and I wouldn't try to talk you out of that. I believe there's no one right way to preach other than my way, but you know what I mean. I suppose the main accent point that I want to make this morning is that I think all of the schematic attempts to relate the Old Testament to the New by way of promise and fulfillment or by way of law and gospel are hopelessly reductionist and do not help us at all. So and Reverend Childs, I've learned a great deal from Reverend Childs, but Reverend Childs has insisted that we have to read every text according to the canon, and by the time Reverend Childs gets done, it all sounds like Calvin's Institutes, which isn't good for Lutherans or Presbyterians. So my advocacy is that you take a text and let the text be the text and sit with the text and let the faithful have the text. Because I believe that God's Spirit works in, with, and under the text. And it is the detail of the text, if we have patience with it. So I was thinking last night, if you take the corpus of Emily Dickinson, you don't want canonical generalizations about Emily Dickinson's work. What you want to do is to track the words in the text. So it is. So that's my introduction. Now, the way I want to begin is to talk about totalism. Go like that. Totalism. You're not doing it. Come on, you Lutherans, get your hands up. Totalism. My colleague Erskine Clark, who's a very sedate church historian, was in church one Sunday when the youth led church, and the youth asked everybody to go like that, and Erskine said it was the first time he had ever had his hands above his ears in church. So, by totalism I mean a system and ideology that contains all possible options. The notion of totalism comes to us from the Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas, who wrote a book entitled Totality and Infinity. And by totality he means this, and by infinity he means this. So he thinks totality is a bad thing and infinity is a good thing. But I learned about totality by reading Robert Lifton. I don't know whether you know Robert Lifton. He is a scholar who has spent his life studying atrocities. He studied the Holocaust and the outcomes of that. He studied in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs. He studied what the nuclear threat was doing to the American psyche. And what he observed about the Nazis and about the Japanese war system and about American bombers is that every one of those systems was a totalizing system that thought it ought to have total control, and you get total control not only by controlling all of the economic and political resources, but by having a monopoly of imagination so that nothing is thinkable or imaginable outside the dominating system. Now, if I were to do a history of totalisms, you would recognize them. Pharaoh in the Old Testament is the first totalizing system, and there's nothing outside of Pharaoh's totality except the wilderness, where there are no jobs, and when we went there we didn't know whether there was any food or water or bread. I think in the main chronology of the Old Testament, the Jerusalem elites of the kings and the priests and the scribes established an ideological totalism in which God's presence was in the temple, and the temple was the media center that monopolized imagination, and the way you got along in the world was to subscribe to the totalism. In the period of the New Testament, the Roman Empire organized and administered such a totalism so that ordinary people were able to say, we have no king but Caesar. We have no way to live in the world except to subscribe to the Roman Empire. Now, this is all a setup for what I want to say to you about our preaching. And here's my proposal: that the totalism in which U.S. Christians live is the totalism of market ideology that is connected to U.S. exceptionalism, that is supported by an aggressive military that wants to control world markets under the guise of globalism. So you get nationalism, militarism, consumerism, and all, see if you think this is true, all totalisms end in violence. So now we're having a big NFL discussion about totalism, and the NFL doesn't intend to do anything about it. It intends to hold a few press conferences till it goes away. Because what could they do about it? It is a sport that depends upon violence. And what I read about these players who are paid to be violent can't just flip a switch and turn it off when they go home. So I want you to reflect on this, the test of the extent to which it is a totalism is the extent to which you may or may not critique it. And I know very many pastors who can critique many things. They can critique the Bible. They can critique the violence of God. They can critique the canon because it left out all of the good Gnostic documents. But you cannot critique the American enterprise system. Maybe Lutherans can, but most church people I know cannot. So that's my first point. My second point is that totalisms always silence. They stop all critical dissenting voices. So I tried to think about silencing in the Bible, and the text that drew me most is the confrontation in Amos 7 between Amaziah the high priest at Bethel and the prophet Amos. And you may recall Amos was a considerable dissenter with his visions. And the priest at Bethel says to Amos, if you're going to talk that way, go south. You cannot talk that way here because this is the king's chapel where never is heard a discouraging word. So just preach grace, please. Just preach grace. It was a silencing. And so the temple apparatus in the northern kingdom, surely like the temple apparatus in the southern kingdom, tried to silence the prophets. And in Amos 5 there is this one little verse that sits there that says, it is a time when the prudent keep silent. So many prudent pastors know where the edge of silence must be. Or if I think that word can also be translated, it is a time for the prosperous to keep silent. Why rock the boat? Or I remember this verse at the end of Habakkuk 2, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth shut up. And I thought for a long time that verse was written by a librarian. But then I had the thought, I'm not sure it's right, but I had the thought that the more affluent a congregation is, the more it likes order and solemnity and quiet. No speaking in tongues here, because the first thing you know, people will get out of control. So be silent in the temple. In the New Testament, I remembered that when Bartimaeus in Mark 10 cried out, "Son of David, have mercy on me!" the disciples tried to shush them. But he cried out all the louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me!" And Jesus said, "What?" Jesus heard. But the disciples didn't want the routine upset. Or in Luke 19, I was not aware of this, the context, but I remembered if you keep silent, the stones will cry out. But I didn't get the context of it. It's Palm Sunday, and they're saying, "Hosanna, Hosanna!" And they tried to stop the disciples from having a parade. If Crossan and Borg are right, the reason they tried to stop the parade was that there was a Roman Empire parade on the other side of town, and you don't want to distract from the big parade of Caesar. But the stones will cry out. And then I remembered that when John Paul II came to Central America and one of the liberation theologians tried to take communion, at the altar the Pope said to him, "Silentio, you Marxist!" Well, the church, when it needs to be, can be a big silencer. Or I learned from reading William Cavanaugh that the Pinochet regime in Chile silenced everybody and created an environment of such mistrust that no one would say anything to anyone. And what Kavanaugh says that the bishops finally figured out, the only antidote to that totalizing silence was the Eucharist. Or do you remember the black power sit-ins in churches that terrorized white congregations? There was a strange confrontation in a big Methodist church in St. Louis when the local representative, James Foreman, stood up in the middle of the church service. They knew he was coming, and the Methodist pastor said, "What do you want here?" And the black guy said, "We've come here to pray." And the pastor said, "You can't pray here. This is a worship service." And now the silencing in our society happens by shriveling the humanities in college curricula and cutting out arts programs in public schools because we can't afford them. We can afford anything that's important, but we can't afford anything that is dangerous. Because if you invite people to critical thought and artistic direction, who knows where they'll go with it? So that's my second point. Totalism kills. Third point is that because silence kills, the silence must be broken. And breaking the silence is very risky. So my thesis is that prophetic preaching, I want to talk about prophetic preaching in a church that is not hospitable to prophetic preaching. I know that. The prophetic preaching is the breaking of the silence of totalism. It utters words and images and narratives and songs that are not permitted but said anyway. And what I want to think with you about is that such prophetic utterance that breaks the silence of totalism is a voice from elsewhere, so that when you hear it, you ask, where did that come from? So I want to think for a minute about what does it mean to have a word that comes from elsewhere? On the one hand, we know that prophetic speech in the Old Testament is human speech. It's right on the lips of the men and women who talk that way. It grows out of lived human experience, so that we spent a great deal of time on what Fleming James called prophetic personalities. And we thought we could recover and reconstruct those prophetic personalities, beginning with Hosea's marriage and running through Jeremiah's laments and all of that. Now we are told that's all construction, but whatever. So I have the sense that Amos's strictures about justice were human speech by this speaker who found the practices of oppression and exploitation simply intolerable. The justice utterances come out of the sense that the system is wounding. And it is speech that comes out of woundedness. Or, if one reads alternatively in Ezekiel, which we hardly ever do, I think the repulsion that Ezekiel speaks about is in some great measure his own utter disgust with the violations of holiness that he couldn't tolerate. And he imagined that God couldn't tolerate. So when you say it's a voice from elsewhere, it is a voice from outside the totalism that is uncredentialed and unwelcome and without pedigree. But the prophetic tradition also wants to claim, on the other hand, this is not human speech. This is a word from the Lord. So you have the sense in hearing the artistry and the urgency of prophetic utterance that these words have been given. And one senses their transcendent force that is beyond the force of personality. So what you get in this word from elsewhere is imagery and metaphor that hardly ever, did you notice, hardly ever discusses an issue. They don't take up the Panama Canal or abortion or any of the things that we think we have to be prophetic about. But they are simply words that are bearing witness to the fact that the totalism does not account for everything that is lively in our common life. So you get language that is elusive, hyperbolic, offensive, disjunctive, amazing, all of which is in contrast to a memo, because the totalism lives by memos. And the more the church depends on memos, the more it has conformed, I think, to the totalism of market assumptions. But the word that breaks the silence of totalism creates historical possibility. It transposes a venue of silence which is likely to be conformist, either in despair or in self-sufficiency, into new possibility. Have you ever been in a psychotherapeutic conversation where your dyadic partner says something to you that takes your breath away and you say, oh, I never saw that. I never had that awareness before. That lets me entertain new possibility that opens the chance that I may make some new decisions and move in some new directions. So this speech from elsewhere that is human speech that comes from God, that's sort of thus saith the Lord, it tends to be welcome because it breaks the totalism, or it tends to be unwelcome because it threatens the totalism. And what they regularly did, Klaus Westermann has shown us, they regularly speak judgment, which is kind of Friday speech, or they speak hope, which is Sunday speech. And if you think about it, what you will discover is that totalisms do not believe in judgment. They don't believe we ever have to be accountable to anybody. And totalisms do not believe in hope because they think there are no new possibilities that we don't already administer. So preaching is this strange breaking of the silence. Sometimes it's welcomed because the silence is oppressive. Sometimes it's threatening because the silence feels better. To speak judgment and hope, so that the great prophetic books are arranged as judgment and hope. So you get first Isaiah, and then beginning at chapter 40, you get hope. Jeremiah is not quite so clean, but it breaks about chapter 28 when you get Hananiah, and in chapter 29 you begin to get promises for new possibilities after deportation. Ezekiel is very symmetrical, so the first 24 chapters are judgment by and large, with some intrusions of some hints of hope, and then chapters 32 following are all hope and new possibility. So preaching out of this tradition is a dissenting voice that refuses the silence and invites us to think about the deathly choices that our totalism is making that will end in deathliness, and invites us to think about hope that the totalism cannot entertain. So I want to talk about judgment, because I know you can't preach judgment. Terry and I would agree there's no supernatural intrusion of judgment from God in the sky, whatever. But this is the way I want to phrase it, and I just want to give you these two phrases. That's my gift to you today. That prophetic preaching is the articulation of non-transgressible limits. You cannot transgress them with impunity. You cannot transgress holiness with impunity, so I have come to think in our society that the opposite of holiness is pornography, by which I do not mean naked women, by which I mean the pornography of homeless people on the streets is treated as normal, by which I mean torture is now acceptable policy in the interest of our security, by which I mean all of those pathological practices that we have come to think are simply acceptable because we are God's chosen people in the world, and we have to do those things to get along with our destiny as God's beacon of freedom and all of that good stuff. Or prophetic justice is an articulation of non-transgressible limits that have to do with the violation of the neighbor. And I think probably when you come to talk about judgment, that Terry and I probably are in agreement, he can speak for himself about this, that the deathly practices contain within themselves the seeds of our destruction. So that it just takes very little imagination to reason from slavery to Ferguson, Ferguson was an inevitable outcome of slavery, etc., etc., etc. So, one of the wonderful speeches of judgment that I take to be kind of the quintessential expression is this incredible poetry in Hosea 4. The Lord has a lawsuit against Israel, and then the indictment is there is lying, stealing, killing. It's the Decalogue. That's what there is. And then the third verse says, therefore is an amazing prophetic word because it hides all of the connections that are not traced out scientifically. Therefore, the land mourns, which is an idiom for drought. Therefore, you get drought, and the birds and the beasts and the fish are all disappearing. So the succinct poetry that doesn't explain anything, because poetry doesn't explain, is the violation of the Decalogue will lead to the destruction of creation. Who knew that? You can fill it in scientifically. If you steal enough, you will cut down the rainforest, and you will pollute the ozone, and creation will evaporate before your very eyes. But he didn't do all that. But what he is tracing is non-transgressible limits. You cannot violate the neighbor without losing your habitat. Market ideology believes that you can do anything if you're smart and rich and fast and well connected. And if you want to play the market game, what? You got to get your kids to soccer practice on Sunday. Do they do that in Minnesota, soccer practice on Sunday morning? Because getting your kid ready to participate in the market is surely more important than participating in the other liturgy around Jesus. So it's required. It's required that there be no Sabbath. It's required that you stay busy getting ready for market ideology all the time, or you will be left behind. It is required. And the dots are not connected. So prophetic preaching is connecting the dots. Connecting the dots about how our participation in the totalism is an option for death. Or prophetic preaching has to do with hope. The most dangerous thing a prophetic preacher can say is that Christ is risen, which means that by the power of God, he has outflanked the execution by the state. So we don't think enough about prophetic preaching as the preaching of hope. And here's my second formula, that prophetic preaching is witnessing to the originary means comes from nowhere, the originary stirrings of divine fidelity that are inexplicable, in which newness occurs where there was no reason to expect newness. And every pastor sees that. Every pastor can resonate with 2nd Isaiah's poetry where God says, for a long time I have kept silent, God says. I held my tongue, but now I will gasp, I will pant like a woman in labor, I will bring forth newness. Not because Cyrus summoned me, not because anybody summoned me, I just am going to do it. And the pastoral task is to bear witness to these ordinary stirrings. So who knew that apartheid could end? Who knew that the Lutheran Church, through a little bit of trauma, would finally understand that gays belong to the body of Christ? Who knew that the movement of the 99% isn't finished yet? So about these originary stirrings, Isaiah can say, have you not known? Do you not hear? Have you not seen? And people who live in the totalism have not known and have not seen and have not heard. For how shall they hear without a preacher? I often wonder what it was like that day when Isaiah got chapter 65. He just got it. A new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. Not in heaven, but a new Jerusalem where there'll be no more foreclosures on houses. There'll be no more infant mortality. He lines it out, no more infant mortality. Cincinnati, where I live, has the second worst infant mortality rate of any city in the United States. Who knew that it doesn't have to be? Or Jeremiah about a new covenant that is grounded in God's promise that I will forgive your sin and remember your iniquity no more. It is a radical, unexpected newness in the 6th century. Or Ezekiel, after he hammered at them a while, has this strange imagination in chapter 47 about water coming out from under the altar that is ankle deep and knee deep and hip deep. And finally, there will be fish in the Dead Sea because fresh water will come. Who knew? So I imagine Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel standing alongside Martin, and they all say, I have a dream. I have a dream that will not be produced by the totalism. I have a dream that will be given from elsewhere, and the congregation meets to be receptive to that new originary stirring of divine fidelity. The church very often colludes in silence about things that must not be talked about because you don't want to upset the big donors. I did a little Bible study at my church, and there was a really old, conservative, richest guy in the church. Came up to me afterwards and he said, "How long do we have to care for the poor?" And I thought he was joking. He was, to coin a phrase, dead serious. The church is the venue that hosts the Word from elsewhere. The church is the community where the unthinkable gets thought and the unsayable gets said. The church is the great violator of the totalism. Because the church knows that our life is not given to us by the powers of the totalism, but our life is given to us from elsewhere. So I thought of these two texts that you Lutherans know very well from Paul. I think they are the two times when Paul uses the word being in a participial form. I'm not very good at Greek grammar. But in 1 Corinthians 1:8, which you know very well about the cross, after he talks about the foolishness of the cross and the weakness of the cross, and then he says, consider your call, brothers. Not many of you were rich, not many of you were wise, not many of you were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish and weak. And does this give you chill bumps? God chose to bring to nothing the things that be. That's the verb, that be. That's prophetic judgment. It is to show that the claims of the totalism are vacuous, because the totalism cannot keep its promises. The market ideology cannot make us safe and cannot make us happy, which is what it promises to do. The other usage, which is the counterpoint, is in Romans 4:17 about the God of Abraham, who calls into existence things that do not be. That's originary. So 1 Corinthians 1:28 is about judgment. It is about the nullification of an illusionary world that in our time comes packaged as market ideology. And Romans 4 is Sunday news about the newness that the totalism cannot generate. So prophetic preaching has entrusted to it the utterance that comes from elsewhere that exposes the totalism as a failed project that cannot lead to life. So finally, I want to comment on the book of Acts, about which I don't know much. You know, for a very long time, everybody has seen that the book of Acts is about the church under the powerful leadership of the Spirit. That's clear, Pentecost and all that. But until we began to get colonial and post-colonial studies, I think we did not notice that the book of Acts is occupied by the Roman Empire. I can't believe that when I was in seminary, we were taught from Hans Kunzelmann that Luke took great care not to offend the Roman Empire. Well, they must have not read Luke. Because the disciples, the apostles, led by the Spirit, are continually preaching the resurrection that calls into existence things that do not exist. So they are accused of turning the empire upside down. And invariably, when they preach the resurrection, they're hauled into court under Roman governors, Felix and Festus and Agrippa. Now you understand, they are not hauled into court to sort things out. They are hauled into court to intimidate them. They're hauled into court to be pushed back into conformity to the claims of the Roman Empire. But the testimony of the book of Acts is that the Spirit is relentless. It is a spirit that, as Jesus said to Nicodemus, blows where it will. It comes and goes, and the empire can't stop it. So I have thought that the life of the church and the life of the preacher now is something like reperforming the book of Acts, in which one is urged and pressed by the Spirit to announce that the Easter juices of life have been unleashed in the world and constantly being checked and called to account by the voices of the totalism that would like that dangerous emancipation to be curbed. And as you know, the book of Acts ends in Rome, and the last line says that he was preaching the kingdom of God, teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and unhindered in Rome. Every preacher has to preach in Rome. Every preacher has to preach at the center of the totalism. And I don't know if you like me, but I can write a hell of a sermon. But when I get up to preach, I look out there and I say, uh-oh, I can't say that. And I see all these people, see these Presbyterian elders sitting there like that. Unhindered, because it is a voice from elsewhere. Well, that's my shtick. We have time, and if you would like to respond or tell me what you're thinking or pursue things.
There are two microphones, one in the center aisle and one in this other main aisle. Please come. We're going to talk. We'll take questions till about 10:30, which is 20 minutes.
Jim.
Dr. Brueggemann, thank you so much for being here. We've had a long relationship, and you have influenced me since my first, Old Testament 101, in which your book, Prophetic Imagination, was assigned to us by Patrick Miller. We had to read it, whether we wanted to or not. So for 24 years, you have been a friend, a mentor, a guide, an Old Testament prophet come to life. So I thank you for your ministry.
Thank you.
But I'd also like to blame you for a whole bunch of things. Because of you, it made increasingly less sense to be confined in a Korean immigrant church context when I was fluent in the language of this society and the culture that I was embedded in, to open up the gospel to all peoples. So I left the nice, safe cocoon of the Korean immigrant church to branch out. Because of you, some of us launched Church of All Nations 10 years ago, and that's been a wonderful gift for many of us. Because of you, we launched Underground Seminary this month, and it's been an incredible joy to be a part of that. But also because of you, a few years ago, I was taken to court, church court, in my presbytery, and was found guilty of infringing on the rights and views of another regarding the freedom of conscience. So in other words, no sex, drugs, or rock and roll, not even sex, lies, and videotape. Just offending the sensibilities of a white person who felt that I was not living into the type of the Asian immigrant, emasculated, deferential person. So because of you, I have no doubt that in future years I will be defrocked by the mainline Presbyterian Church and be out in the wilderness, which I'm prepared to do. But I wonder, is there really such a thing as a civil civilization? According to people like Stanley Diamond and Derek Jensen and other really innovative thinkers, civilization itself is an oppressive force. And the exponent of civilization we have today, Western civilization, which has hegemony and totalism all over the globe, is the mainline church's role to moderate this oppression? Or can we really enter into a prophetic imagination of a totally post-civilization way of being? And is that kind of imagination possible within the mainline framework?
Well, I suppose that strategically, each of us is located where we are located. I'm a tenured guy. I didn't run any of those risks. And we all run the risks we're able to run, and we all make the compromises that we think we have to make. So I'm not championing heroic action. But I think that if we, in our own consultations, do not reflect on the radicality of what has been entrusted to us, then we cannot think clearly and we cannot make honest decisions. But when we have thought critically and prayed honestly, then I think we make the decisions that we are able to make and we live with them. And obviously many of us have found it either possible or necessary to remain within the kind of reliable structures. But every once in a while, one finds oneself being restless and stepping a foot out or entertaining a thought or grabbing onto another image and getting taken up in very risky stuff. So I don't think that one can answer that programmatically, because I don't think that we know what the Spirit will lead any of us to do. But it seems to me you have rightly identified that if you take many steps in that direction, it is a very high-risk venture. How's that for a mousy answer?
Good enough for now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Courage to you.
Thanks, Walter, for the talk. You actually made reference to 3rd Isaiah, and so I wanted to return to that with my question.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to enter Advent soon enough, a time of both remembering Christ's coming and then hoping for it in the future. But many of these texts that we use to shape our imagination for the eschaton and for the future are actually deeply involved in these totalitarian, totalistic ideologies that you make reference to, which are in most cases grounded in Zion theology, right? And so the way that we hope toward the future is actually shaped by those kinds of royal ideologies. And so my question to you is this: with that in mind, how do we begin to think about the future in ways that don't replicate and perpetuate these imperial ideologies that are embedded deeply within the biblical texts themselves?
Yeah, and as you know, they're not only embedded in the text, they're embedded in us.
That's right, yeah.
Well, I agree with you about the Zionist ideology. I think that we have to struggle with the reality that there is a steady critique of Zionist theology in the Old Testament. And it's too bad that in terms of traditional lectionaries, the lectionary has by and large opted uncritically for the Zionist trajectory. And it seems to me we have continually to set over against that the Deuteronomic, for example, even though that participates to some extent, but to find those counter traditions that keep protesting against it or providing alternatives to that, so that we need to get other texts in front of the church besides the conventional Zionist texts. And that's very hard to do because the whole unexamined assumption of the liturgic church is that these are the texts that we ought to perform yet again. And I suspect that we have to use other texts that expose these texts as not being innocent. And I think it is this dialogic interaction among texts. So how would it be if through Advent and so on you take a Zionist text and then have an additional reading that critiques the Zionist? My pastor last year did 4 laments for the 4 Sundays of Advent. He's Episcopal, so I said, I didn't know you could do that. He said, you can either ask the bishop or you can hope the bishop doesn't find out. But he said that lament over the failed world is the right posture to receive the new child. But of course, we are not mostly led in that direction by conventional church practice.
That's helpful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks.
Professor Brueggemann, my question is in line with the prophetic preaching, and you have critiqued the U.S. market ideology of totalism. The U.S. Constitution, as we know, we have the freedom of religion, freedom of speech and the establishment of religion. So, which, to my understanding, advocates tolerance. So,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your last words.
The U.S. Constitution talks about
Yes.
freedom of speech and the establishment of religion, which, to my understanding, is about tolerance. So, but when we talk about the prophetic preaching of the church and the pastors to proclaim the message, we go beyond the status quo in a sense, like we have to go proclaim even against the corruption, whatever. So do we need to revise the U.S. amendment, or what is your option? Because to bring transformation, we need to even change the corporate.
So is your question hearing me not allow for tolerance? what exactly is the question? I can't hear you too well.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry. I'm saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my observation as an outsider, the church seems to be a little timid to go too boldly,
Timid.
Yeah.
Timid, yes.
Timid. So, in that sense, and to go beyond the status quo, or because the law is there.
Yeah.
So, what do you say about that? What is your?
Well, I think the church can count on freedom of speech, but it can't count on all of its donors allowing the pastor to have freedom of speech. So in the church, freedom of speech is not free, it's very costly. But Jesus didn't get executed by the empire for saying nice things. He got executed because he exposed the deafness of the empire and because he proposed an alternative that he called the kingdom of God. So he was free to say that, but it was very costly. And I think in the church we are free to say that, but it tends to be very costly. I got this phrase from, is it the novelist Kundera, who wrote The Lightness of Being? Kundera. He uses the phrase religious kitsch. From that I got, if a sermon doesn't create some edginess, it probably is religious kitsch. We have a young priest in our church who hasn't yet learned to preach. And we had this lectionary text, I have come to set father against son and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And his sermon was, can't we just all get along? And people loved it. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God.
Hi, I'm Dana. We're so grateful to have you back here in the Twin Cities. I work also at a Church of All Nations in Columbia Heights, also Presbyterian. I'm going to read my question, so I don't mix up words or something, so forgive me. You talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they created a totalistic environment, like you said. But these political parties were also intentionally creating a space to speak and believe, to have a space to speak and believe against the totalistic destruction of Rome. So they were trying to control an environment, but because there was a larger totalistic place that was trying to control their speech, so they were responding. However, this temple silenced the poor and became more interested in its own preservation than being concerned for the poor.
Yep.
In the same way, I think many pastors who see themselves practicing prophetic preaching often create their own totalistic universe over against a larger totalistic universe. But the problem is many younger generations in one way, and many communities of colors in very different ways feel very silenced by this trying to create space against silencing becomes a new silencing. And many feel silenced in mainline church walls. The church has become a great creator of totalism also, not just the great creator of silence in the midst of totalism. And I wonder how we talk about, how we claim the word prophetic without naming the ways we have been as much a force of creating a totalistic environment as a prophetic voice.
Yep.
And if it's dangerous to use the word prophetic too quickly without admitting to ourselves that we can be creating a totalistic environment that someone else can find silencing, even if we find it
Yep.
a place to speak.
Yep.
When I see the ministry of Jesus, he didn't claim to be prophetic. He loved the poor. And I wrestle with what this means for the mainline church, how to be a pastor,
Yep.
what it means for preaching, and how we speak about preaching. And I just was wondering if you could
Yep.
speak to that.
Well, let me respond first of all to the historical, to what you triggered for me when you talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Roman Empire could only function because it had the collusion of local officials. So the American Empire can only operate because we've got puppets in Manila and all those places who do our bidding. My impression about the New Testament, it's not my field, is that the Sadducees were colluders with Rome, but the Pharisees, I think, were on Jesus' side, which is why he engages them so much that they're trying to figure out together how to be a community of resistance. That's I think. What I want to say about what you're really asking about, and it's very hard for somebody who's old and white and male and tenured, but it's true anyway,
We forgive you, it's okay.
that every settlement we arrive at is a momentary one that right away needs to be called into question. And it is our endless temptation when we arrive at a new settlement to think, now we've got it. Until we become attentive to a new wave of dissenters that require us to do it again and again and again. So the Fretheim lectures, it's wonderful about the word that's used is ongoing critical reflection for the sake of the faithful. The ongoingness means that whatever settlement we arrive at immediately is called into jeopardy by the Spirit, which is not easy for any of us. Yeah, but you're exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I was struck when you talked about theology can give us a new lens, and it should be broad, the infinite piece of it. How do you see the doctrine of original sin working in totalism, or how do you see that binding us or being helpful or playing out in the conversation of totalism?
Well, I said I was a very soft Calvinist. I don't know how to think about original sin if it's original and inherited. But if original sin means we are deeply and profoundly and endlessly out of sync with God, then it follows that we will always be transposing God into our favorite idolatry. And totalism is, in the very fact that it's totalistic, is in principle idolatrous. On 4th of July Sunday, our young associate priest was preaching, and this old guy came in with an American flag this big, and he thought he would surprise the young priest, and he said, I'd like for you to carry this in when you process. Well, the guy shrewdly said, ask the rector. But then they didn't, so the guy himself carried the flag down the aisle and sat through the service holding it. It's a perfect act of idolatry. and we all are seduced.
Yeah.
So I think original sin, if it's not understood in silly ways, is greatly illuminating for where we have to live our life and how we have to try to live our life. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll take one more question.
Okay, my question is about how we both preach, or how one would both preach prophetically, which has a kind of strength, an inherent strength to it, and not a certainty, but a groundedness in this spirit that we believe is doing something more. I work as a hospital chaplain, and I often visit with people, and I've been somewhat surprised over the last 20 years to see how timid they are to push against what they've been taught. When their faith meets the real context of their illness, they're often imagining that there ought to be some other way to move towards that, but they feel limited by the way that they have been taught to think about God. So how might you advise us to preach a prophetic word which yet invites a more timid parishioner to move into that imagination, claiming their own capacity to do the same? Because they might interpret that you've got the faith to do that, but not me.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think, and I think what you mean particularly is that what we've been taught is denial so that God will remain glorified. So I think the lament psalms are a terrific resource, and you already know this. They are voices of honesty that people regularly are surprised that faithful people can talk that way. And so I would think that much of the work is giving people permission to say the unsayable. And I think liturgically we've got to quit singing so many triumphalist hymns. And all of that celebrates as though we've got a package of certitudes and all you have to do is sign up for it, when in fact everybody knows better than that. But I didn't know the pastor knew that, and so on. So I think it is modeling honesty. Of course, there's a great hazard for the pastor to model honesty, because then they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you're so upset." Yeah. Many people dare not entertain the thought that their faith is really connected to what they sense in their life. So connecting dots is, you already knew all that, so thank you. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Brueggemann again.